This is Tamor Hussain standing in for reviewer Steve Watts. Trials of Mana is not a bold reinvention. While it has been given a graphical overhaul and added systems that help flesh out and modernize the combat systems, this remake of a once obscure RPG is very much rooted in its own history. And by some combination of that history and the modern enhancements, it has a bundle of great ideas that are often hampered by others that are obtuse or confusing. From the start, Trials of Mana distinguishes itself from other traditional Japanese RPGs by presenting a pool of heroes. The first thing you do is select 3 of the 6 characters to be your party, and that decision will last throughout the game. You can swap between any of these characters in the heat of battle, while the other 2 will manage on their own with some simple preset behaviors. But your primary character is treated as the game's protagonist during major story moments. It's an inventive idea that adds a layer of personalization and a crisscrossing narrative. The stakes of the overall story remain the same, but by presenting you with a selection of 6 different prologues, you get to see the various motivations that led your custom-built party to be thrown into this grand adventure.
You have my blessing on your journey.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
The other characters that you left unchosen appear in brief cameos, and it's implied that their own quest is still happening just off camera as they go it alone. However, this quality cuts both ways. Trials of Mana has you choose the 3 who will last you for the entire adventure before you know anything about them or how the game will proceed. While all team compositions are probably viable, some are more sensible than others, so it's entirely possible to get knee deep before wishing you'd made different choices. I had chosen Reese as my main character with the promise that she's a strong range fighter, with the brawler Kevin and healer Charlotte as my backup. I imagined hanging back and doing range damage, while Kevin pulled aggro. Several hours in, I realized that her ranged abilities are fairly limited, and as I was fighting up close anyway, I might as well be controlling Kevin instead, since his aggressive fighting style and powerful attacks were much more satisfying. I also regretted choosing Charlotte, albeit for completely different reasons. Much of the English voice acting in Trials of Mana is hokey and stilted, but fine and functional enough. Charlotte's is obnoxious, in large part because the localization accents her youthfulness with a heavy speech impediment.
Heath is still lost.
If it was meant to be endearing, it failed. I had reservations the moment my characters met up with her, but by then I didn't want to turn back and repeat the beginning of the game. Plus, Charlotte is also the only dedicated healer, so just about any given team composition would likely need to include her.
I'm coming with you, whether you like it or not.
The characters themselves are familiar fantasy tropes, but strangely, many of them share almost identical qualities too. All 3 of my characters were heirs to a noble family, 2 of them an actual prince and princess chased out of their kingdom by family strife or tragedy. There's nothing necessarily wrong with leaning on these archetypes for a fantasy story, but it feels formulaic when seeing them back to back in 3 different prologues. Most of the time in Trials of Mana is spent in combat, interspersed with simple pathfinding and occasional platforming. The combat is surprisingly fluid, especially in the late game when you've unlocked a wide array of moves and combos. The Mana series is known for being action focused, and this remake lovingly captures that quality in its transition from 2D to 3D. Combat feels weighty, and the powerful class strike abilities grant the appropriate feeling of overwhelming your opponents. Upgrading your character eventually leads to bigger combo chains, giving you more versatility in the heat of battle. By the end, it feels so naturally like a character action game that its RPG roots are just running under the hood. As enjoyable as the combat is though, some of the elements surrounding the battle system can be confusing or obtuse. You start earning elemental spirits, which grant magical abilities, long before you could reasonably have leveled up enough to gain access to those abilities.
Huh?
Tooltips kept telling me I could equip these spells in the training menu, implying they were immediately available, and I spent too much time hunting for abilities that didn't yet exist. The 3rd tier class upgrades, which are already gated behind a level requirement, are also gated behind special seeds, and the game isn't immediately clear about where to look for them. And once you find those seeds, the classes they grant are randomized between a handful of sets, so you may not get the variant you wanted.
Curses! What is this?
The story meanders oddly, with the nemesis introduced in various prologues coming and going without much rhyme or reason. The plot runs out of steam about halfway through the main quest, and since the second half of the game is non-linear, the story pieces don't really relate to one another. It's instead a series of vignettes leading up to the reveal of the big bad and a final confrontation. Those stayed elements are unfortunate, because the world of the Mana series is filled with joyful moments of whimsy and weirdness. This is a game in which you travel between villages by being shot out of a cannon built by a gnome named Von Boyage. Once you need to take to the sea, your method of conveyance becomes a giant turtle wearing a snorkeling gear. Enemies have names like Assastant and Captain Duck. It's just delightfully oddball and helps soften some of the more dire melodrama.
Well, my ears done started burning.
Trials of Mana stands on the strength of its combat, and the fact that it's how you spend the vast majority of your time. That easy recommendation comes qualified with several elements that don't work nearly as well, from dull and hodgepodge storytelling to bewildering progression systems. Seeing a historical curiosity through the lens of a mostly modernized action RPG was enough to pull me through the experience despite my quibbles though, so there's certainly still life in the world of Mana.